Welcome to the HealthyXSundays podcast, where we bring you the most critical and actionable content in the nutrition and fitness space. Dave from Mind Muscle Pro and I, Kunal Jain, also known as Veg Diet Coach, are your hosts. Today's guest is Greg Mushen, a technologist with a background in health and a systems-based approach to understanding the body. After facing a serious mold-related illness, Greg became deeply focused on optimizing metabolic health, movement, and longevity. He's passionate about big picture thinking, from energy efficiency and gut health to genetics and personalized supplementation. And he's currently building Dark Lab, a project exploring GLP-1 agonists and long-term weight management. Greg's mission is simple yet powerful: to reverse engineer chronic disease, and live a long, purposeful life with his family. So, welcome, Greg. Thanks for making.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
A pleasure. So, Greg, we want to talk about your biohacking journey. You transitioned from a tech veteran to a biohacker. So, can you talk about a little bit of introduction about yourself in your own words?
Yeah, you bet. So, it's actually been kind of like a lifelong passion of mine. I grew up in a medical family. My dad was MD, my mom was a nurse, and it was just kind of medical information was always kind of permeating in our household. But my dad, I think was kind of like an OG biohacker in a lot of ways. He was always doing these self experiments on himself. I remember the first one that I saw, he was testing his urine pH. This was in the 80s. So I was always like really intrigued with that, with, seeing a role model of mine trying to make his health better. I remember another one that was kind of funny that I'll just tell you. He was trying to get his cholesterol down, and this is in the 90s when we thought that like just any kind of fat caused cholesterol. So we went an entire month. I think he had a gram of fat or something like that in the entire month. And at the end of the experiment, like he was jaundiced, his skin was flaking off, his cholesterol actually went up. And that was actually kind of a pivotal moment for me, because he concluded that there was nothing he could do to like change his cholesterol. To me, what I concluded was, wow, fat is really important.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of continued my entire life. That's actually what got me into nutrition, was that moment, like trying to learn a little bit more about fat, because I felt like what was being told, kind of in the mainstream, didn't meet my observations of what I'd seen with my dad. So it's just kind of continued from there. But I think things really changed when I had my daughter. I had her at 40 years old. I'm 49 right now. And I went to this wedding, and there's a bride in her 40s there, and her dad wasn't there to walk her down her aisle. And so I kind of started doing the math, and that was a very pivotal moment for me, because I realized that I needed to do everything to stay around as long as I can for my daughter.
Yeah. So you do a lot of reading, Greg, and you talk about levers for metabolic health. What do you think are the biggest levers for metabolic health based on your research?
Yeah, I think probably one of the biggest ones I would say is movement, just like accumulating as much low level movement as you can. We see this in subsistence populations who have like excellent metabolic health. The Chimane, for example, they're in South America. They walk 17,000 steps a day in this like really hilly terrain. They have a pretty low fat diet, but they have some of the best cardiometabolic health on the planet. In fact, their CAC scores, coronary artery calcium, is the lowest that's ever been recorded in a population. So yeah, I think movement is probably the biggest one. I'll tell you one other study that has always stuck in my mind. They took some type 2 diabetics, and they had half of them walk about 50 minutes postprandially, so after the meal, and the other half took metformin, and then they did another one that was combined. And what they found was that 50 minutes of movement after eating was more effective than metformin alone. So I think that movement is probably one of the best levers. I would say like number 2 is probably, making sure that you're eating at caloric maintenance. so you're not, over consuming calories. I think honestly, if you get those two right, you've probably got about 80, 90% of it. The third one I think would be getting enough protein. Protein is incredibly important because our entire body is made of it. So getting enough protein is going to be pretty important. It's going to help preserve muscle mass, which can help sequester glucose after meals. We store, especially if you're moving through GLUT4, which can move glucose into the muscle independent of insulin. So I think those are probably the big three. I try to keep things simple. So I think that if you did those three things and you did it over a long period of time and you maintained like a healthy weight, decent body composition, you'd probably be all right.
Yeah, sounds right. Keeping things simple as well as doing over a long period of time. And this is quite interesting because we are going to talk about fiber next. And Dave, you want to take the next question?
So, Greg, you speak a lot about, actually, you post a lot about hunter-gatherers and how uh, they don't have much heart disease. And these days, there's always a discussion about this is the ideal diet, this is how our ancestors used to eat. And people always have a misconception of some sort regarding that. So, what did they do right, and what did they not do right? And how can we adapt our modern diet to what close to what our ancestors did?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what's really interesting when you look at hunter-gatherers or just subsistence populations is how varied the diets are. It's absolutely incredible. Like on one end of the spectrum, you have the Chimane in South America. They eat, I think, 70% carbs, about 10% fat, 20% protein. They're the ones that I was mentioning earlier that have like by far the best cardiometabolic health on the planet for a group that we've seen. On the other end, which is kind of extreme, you have the Maasai. And so they consume between 100, 200 grams of saturated fat per day. A lot of this is from milk from the cattle that they have. They'll actually take out blood from the cattle, have that. Um, but they do have a little bit of atherosclerosis, but I think that they counter that with walking 12 to 16 miles per day. And so it's amazing like the wide range of diets that you can have. Another one that like doesn't really fit into kind of traditional hunter gatherers, but I love to bring it up is actually the Amish population in the United States. And so the Amish are kind of this population in the United States that don't use a lot of technology. They'll still travel around by horse and buggy, but their diet's really interesting. Also pretty high in saturated fat. They have I think 1.5 servings of vegetables per day. They eat sweets. They eat I think 1.75 servings of cake or donuts, pie per day, and they hardly get any fiber. But they're out there moving every day. They're walking 18,000 steps, and they have much lower incidence rates of like chronic disease than the United States population at large. So, I think that's when I looked at all of this, that's what really kind of convinced me that movement is so important, and movement, especially kind of in that, I would say like 14 to 20,000 steps per day. You apparently can counteract a lot of diet flaws with just getting that. And the cutoff appears to be what's called PAL. So it's the physical activity level, and that's a ratio of how much you're exercising over your base metabolic rate. And you could think of base metabolic rate is like how many calories do you burn if you're just like in a hospital bed, not doing anything. So if that ratio is around 2, that appears to be kind of where chronic disease starts to fade. So yeah, but I would say even though there's variation, I think that you could also look at the variation of like plaque formation within these populations. And, you can kind of get a sense of what appears to be better. And to me, it's a lot more like the chamane diet, where you have, a good amount of carbs. They're getting quite a bit of fiber in their diet, fermentable fiber. It's around, I'd say like 20, 30 grams of fermentable fiber, not total fiber, because total fiber will be a little bit more. And 20% protein, 10% fat around there. Something like that appears to be a lot better than, the Amish diet or, the Maasai diet. And then the Maasai diet, because I know a lot of people online will kind of point at the Maasai and say, see, you can eat, pretty much all the saturated fat that you want. Things are fine, but it's all contextual. They are moving so much that they are able to, really clear all of that, cholesterol and fat. And the other thing too is they have like pretty much world-class genetics for clearing that. So, a lot of this will come down to genetics too. If you have things like clearance genetics, like the Amish, so the Amish will have like 12% of the Amish population will have this variation in clearance genes. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but for them, they'll still have high cholesterol. They'll have higher rates of heart disease, that small little subset. So a lot of it comes down to not only just eating, a good diet, but making sure that you match that to your genetics for clearance. And that's going to be a little bit different for everyone. So yeah, I also think that there's a high degree of variability, individual variability for diets too, that needs to be accounted for.
All right. So how practical are these? Like there is a movement, at least the carnivore diet, where they say like they're trying to replicate those ancestral diets, or at least the Maasai version. So how practical are those, right, in the modern context? Because clearly we don't drink blood. I hope so.
Yeah.
So like how practical is it when they say like
Well,
they're
I would
trying to
say
replicate it?
I'll kind of start with, I'm pretty agnostic toward diet. I think that, diet is going to be the thing that gets you results. I know for a lot of people, they have, reported that they've gotten incredible results off of the carnivore diet. And so, I don't want to, discount anyone's results that they've had on that, because there's just a lot of anecdotal stories of how people kind of turn things around. That being said, I don't think that I think a lot of people do it, thinking that it's this, what we did, 50, 60,000 years ago, kind of like how we evolved. And I think at one point in time, probably from about 2000 to 2016, it was very common to think that, because when scientists would kind of evaluate, tissue and bone, what they were looking for was basically, the amount of nitrogen in their diet. And the early tests of this would basically show that we were hypercarnivores. So there was a period of like 16 years where a lot of people thought that, Neanderthals and home basically other humanoids were hypercarnivore. That all changed in 2016 when there was this paper. It was by NATO et al. NIATO et al. It was in 2016, if you want to go look at that. So they used a different method of analysis called CSIA. And what that showed was that Neanderthals were getting like up to 20% of their diet from plant protein. And so, just measuring things a little bit differently, a little more accurately, really kind of changed what we knew about that. And then they also started using dental calculus as well. So the science is really evolving in that era. But I would say, it's kind of difficult to know exactly what we ate 50,000 or more years ago. It's just very hard. But kind of the current evidence is not that we, just ate meat and nothing else. That's not what the current evidence shows. As much as people, might like to believe that.
Right. So, so essentially, when it comes down to healthy diet, you think the good old eat less, move more advice holds?
Yeah, I do. I mean, so I know that there, a lot of people that say that keto doesn't work, calories in, calories out, that it has a lot of flaws, and it does have flaws. But I would say, you know, the um, the idea that there's energy balance, I think, is really solid. There's over 50 years of research on that, and if you look at the metabolic ward studies, where they can really control the diets, the inputs and the outputs, um, it calories will explain over 90% of energy balance. And so, it may not be perfect, but it's pretty good. It's probably the best thing that we have right now. And if you get into a deficit, you will lose weight. There was this one study, it was an N=1, so you know take it with a grain of salt, but it was the Twinkie experiment. And so this guy was a nutrition professor, and he wanted to show his class that he could lose weight, basically just living off of Twinkies. And he did lose weight, just as he predicted. And actually, the funny thing is you would think that his blood markers would just be awful after that experiment, but some of them improved. Uh, a lot of these will improve, like your lipids will typically improve when you are in a deficit and you just lose weight. So, yeah, I do think it is as kind of crude as that advice is, just eat less and move more. There is, a lot to it. That being said, I think that one of the reasons why it fails is we're not very good at determining, how much we eat. And, unless we're weighing things, unless we're tracking things, we're probably going to be off by, 10 to 20%. And so that's where I think another reason why people think that, keto doesn't work is, they're not weighing, they're not tracking closely, and, they're not losing weight. And after a while, they just think that, it doesn't work when it's just a tracking problem. So if you're tracking, and if you are, you know, moving as much as you can, at least 10,000 steps or more, you will lose weight, and you just have to give it time.
All right. So, is it right to conclude or right to say that if you are in an energy deficit, the composition of the meals matters less? In the sense, like Masai tribe has a lot of saturated fats in their diet, and the other one has a lot of carbs in their diet. But as long as they are moving more and they are, I suppose, in a calorie deficit, the effects of the macros is minimal.
Yeah, I would say that the important one is protein, because when you're losing weight, you it can be kind of hard to get in enough protein sometimes. But that's a really important one, because if you don't get enough protein when you're in a deficit, your body's going to start pulling the amino acids from your muscles. And so the weight that you lose can be, in some cases, up to 50% muscle. If you look at some of the studies on the GLP-1s, Ozempic and things like that, that's what they'll find a lot of times, is that people will lose a lot of muscle from the weight. I don't think that personally. I don't think that's a result of the GLP-1s. It's not an effect of those. I think what it is their calories are crushed so much, and their calories are so low that they're just not eating enough protein. And maybe not resistance training. Resistance training is going to be another thing that's really important when you're in an energy deficit, because you want to give stimulus to the muscle, so that when you're losing weight, the body will basically say, okay, we need this, we can't get rid of this. So resistance train a few times a week, get enough protein, and and then have a lot of low level movement, and most of that weight should be fat that's coming off. But I would say like beyond protein, I think that it matters a lot less, like kind of how you distribute fat and carbs. Um, when you're resistance training in a deficit, it can be quite exhausting if you don't have enough carbs. So on those days that you're resistance training, I think trying to get enough carbs before you go work out and maybe get a little less fat that day would be a good idea. Or having some carbs pre-workout can be a really good thing to do too. Like maybe a couple tablespoons of honey or something like that right before workout, maybe like an hour or so before. Those things can really help a lot.
Right. Kunal, you can take it.
Right, Greg. So you spoke about fermentable fiber, and what are the best examples people can easily get and incorporate that in their diets?
Oh yeah. So you'll basically have, at a really high level, you have insoluble fiber, and then soluble fiber. A lot of fiber, for whatever reason, people tend to think of just the insoluble part of it, like they're eating cardboard or eating roughage, or, fiber is just going to help them poop a little bit better. So when they think that, they're really thinking about the insoluble. But the in insoluble, getting some insoluble is important. But probably, arguably, what's more important is getting soluble fiber, because that's going to be the fiber that ferments. And the reason why this is important is it's going to in your gut, it's going to basically ferment down to short chain fatty acids. So this would be acetate, propionate, and butyrate. And so this is really important for like gut signaling. And so you have all sorts of things that are signaled by these short chain fatty acids. And an example of this is HDAC. So if you get enough insoluble fiber or soluble fiber, enough fermentable fiber, what it will do is inhibit HDAC. When that happens, the tight junctions in your gut will become tight again. When you don't get enough fiber, those tight junctions are going to start to loosen up a little bit. And another one is FFAR2 and FFAR3. So these are primarily signaled by propionate and butyrate. And what those are going to do, like downstream, is it's going to signal our endogenous production of GLP-1 and also PYY. And so these are the kind of like endocrine hormones that control our hunger. And so that's another thing that it'll really help with, is just controlling your appetite and things like that. So I think it's really important for overall like metabolic health is to get enough fermentable fiber, because your tight junctions are going to be tight, and this is going to prevent endotoxins from getting into your gut, and your hunger is going to be controlled. But the other thing too is, if you don't get enough fiber, you're gonna produce all of these, kind of like toxic byproducts. An example would be like ammonia, or p-cresol is another one. IMP, which is a form of propionate that's been associated with atherosclerosis and also insulin resistance long term. And so that's kind of another argument for getting enough soluble fiber, is just avoiding those byproducts altogether. And so examples of like soluble fiber, there's some in fruit. You get pectin in fruit. That's going to be fermented more in kind of like the proximal colon, which is the entry of the colon. You could think of the colon as like an upside down U, where you have the proximal at the beginning, the transverse in the middle, and then the distal colon at the end. But the idea is to get fiber down to the distal colon, where a lot of the signaling happens. And so to do that, what you really want to do is get this like you can almost think of it like building a fire where you have like these fast fermentable fibers. They're kind of like the kindling. And so that'd be like, pectin's a great example of that. But then you want the big logs, um, the things that are burn slow, going to burn a long time, provide a lot of heat. And so examples of that are going to be like the resistant starches, like RS2 or RS3. Um, and what happens is you get certain starches, you heat them and ideally cool them, and that's going to form a resistant starch, resistant because it's not going to be digested. And so it's going to make it into your colon undigested, which will allow your microbiome to ferment them. So examples of this would be like heated and cooled rice. Like basmati is probably, I think it's the best one because it has like amylose. And when you heat it and you cool it, that'll form RS3. So that's a really good one. Um, Heated and cooled potatoes are another example. Heated and cooled beans. So you could do like dal. Dal would be like, I mean, you really could like form a power meal by just having, Indian leftovers. I think you'd be in for a treat there. Little heated and cooled, heated up basmati rice, heated up dal, and you'd just be like getting amazing amounts of resistant starch there.
That's quite interesting. In India, this concept of refrigerating food or reusing food, it depends household to household, but it's not generally practiced. So this idea of cooking rice and then putting it in the refrigerator and reusing it next day by heating it, it seems very good because it reduces the glycemic load and it introduces also
Yeah.
resistant starch, which is good fiber. Um, but is there any concern about mold in rice if you store it like 24 hours or something? Is there any concern regarding mold forming in rice?
I not that I've seen. I don't think that that's too big of a concern if you're eating it within a few days.
Right.
I think it's fine. Obviously, like if you wait a week or longer, the risk is going to increase, exponentially. But a few days is going to be fine.
It's fine. Right.
Yeah,
And on X or social media, we always hear that carbs are non-essential, fiber is non-essential. But by hearing all the details you shared about fermentable fiber, it seems like even if it might not be needed for survival, it is definitely beneficial for our health, human health. So
yeah,
similarly, I want to again, like since we're talking about fiber, I want to just talk to you about protein. Now, protein is something which is a hot topic always. People get confused about from where to get protein. Are there complete amino acid profiles, etc.? And then uh, people who eat meat versus vegans, plant protein. So, what can you just walk us through good protein sources?
yeah. I think a really simple way to think about it is that I don't think it ultimately matters too much. We used to think, back at the day, even like 5 years ago, a lot of people thought that there's this big difference between plant and animal protein, but a lot of the new research shows that there's not as much of a difference as we thought. In fact, there's a really famous researcher named Stuart Phillips, and basically all he researches, the only thing he's researched for like his entire career is protein. And so in some of his new research, is basically showing that they don't find much of a difference. Like once you get up to about 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, there just isn't much of a difference. So, with plant protein, arguably you need a little bit more than you might from animal. But if you're getting 1.6, maybe to 1 point, maybe 2.0 or 2.2 if you're working out hard, I don't really think there's going to be a difference. And I remember seeing this study of it was Italian bodybuilders, and it was vegans versus carnivores or omnivores, I guess, in that case. And even with them, when they were cutting, It was similar results. So I don't think you have to worry about it too much. Just focus on getting enough protein and call it good.
So since we are on the topic of gut, I want to like one more question from my end is that uh, you do mention about the benefits of a low carb keto sort of diet for bringing down liver fat and all that, but I believe, if I recall correctly, you do also emphasize that it might not be the best thing for the gut, or at least there is not enough research to suggest that. So, could you expand on this?
Yeah. So I do think when you look at one of the problems that can happen is liver fat. And what ends up happening is we have really kind of two major kinds of fat in the body. One's going to be right underneath our skin. This is subcutaneous adipose tissue, or SAT. The other one is called visceral adipose tissue, or visceral fat, or VAT. And you could think of it as like um, two storage tanks with an overflow. So once SAT fills up, or subcutaneous, it starts spilling over into visceral. And visceral, so subcutaneous can be like mildly protective, but visceral adipose tissue is associated with all sorts of disease. And one of the reasons why is it's connected to our liver with via the portal vein. And so what will happen is you have all these triglycerides travel from that visceral adipose tissue, and they're kind of, you can think of it as like almost bathing the liver in these triglycerides. They're called DAGs. And so when that happens, it can, your liver gets fat, and that can start inducing a little bit of insulin resistance, like hepatic insulin resistance. And so one of the best ways to reduce liver fat and kind of get things back on track with the research is actually a ketogenic diet, or just doing really low calorie for a couple of weeks. So there's a study where I think people did like 850 calories per day for 2 weeks, and they lost like 30% of their liver fat. But also the kinds of fats that you get when you're doing a ketogenic diet are arguably more important than just getting enough fat. So you really want to prioritize the PUFAs and the MUFAs. And I know PUFAs have a really bad name and a bad rep in the health community, but in this case, they're actually really beneficial. So you want to limit saturated fat, make most of those PUFAs and MUFAs, and that's what's going to really reduce liver fat. When you're doing that, though, yeah, you might not be able to get enough fiber. I think there are ways around this, which would be kind of supplement with it, do a little psyllium husk, like some green banana flour. These are kinds of fermentable starches that really aren't going to count in keto at all. So a couple tablespoons of those, maybe like 5 grams of psyllium husk per meal, and maybe 10 grams or so of like RS2 with the green banana flour. I think something like that would be really ideal.
So we had in one of our previous sessions somebody who created sort of a jackfruit flour. It's high in fiber as well. So
Oh, nice.
that's a very
That's
good
awesome.
idea.
That's a great idea. Yeah, I love jackfruit.
So I think the benefits of the low carb diet or an extreme calorie deficit is very much like we have evidence for that. But where do you think the like the drawbacks are, right? Like how much of the cholesterol stuff, how much of it is like people say LDL doesn't matter. So where do you stand on this?
Oh, I'm sorry. The benefits of
No,
which
I'm
one were
saying
you
like
saying?
the benefits of the low carb keto diet is, I think we are all agreeing on the good side of things, but at least when it comes to the lipids and stuff, there's a bit of a gray area. Like there's always like one
Yeah,
side
yeah,
of
there is. Yeah. I do think in terms of lipids, I think it's going to make a big difference of like the kinds of fats that you substitute. Like if you're going over 10% of your calories from like saturated fat as an example, for most people, that's going to be like where the risk cutoff is, and you start seeing a lot of lipid differences. If you're doing it primarily with PUFAs and MUFAs, you can actually see lipids improve with that. So I do think that fat type matters quite a bit. What you're getting there, and then in terms of like short term and long term, I would say that probably one of the big drawbacks, like longer term, is just not getting enough fiber. Uh, it can also like temporarily downregulate your thyroid, and so you might feel a little sluggish on it. Um, Interestingly enough, it doesn't like long term when you're adapted to it. It doesn't appear to um, modify at least endurance sports that much. In fact, when you look at like glycogen refills after like endurance races, people who've been doing like keto diets and doing endurance sports seem to adapt over time. Um, if you're doing a lot of resistance training and you're kind of hitting a wall, maybe add, some carbs. Maybe that's when you get your like under 50 grams of carbs is just strategically time them, before workouts. But yeah, I think probably the biggest danger would just be like lower fiber over time. And that's just going to, over time, it's just going to, have your gut lining start to become looser and looser, which isn't good. And then also kind of the toxic metabolites that will be byproducts there. Those would be the biggest risks that I could see. But short term, I mean, like I wouldn't even worry about those short term. If your goal is to like remove liver fat, you're doing this for 6 months or so, you're going to get like way more upside, in my opinion, by like targeting that than worrying about, those things.
Right. So, do you think everybody can adapt to a low carb diet the same way, or is it like individual specific?
I think they probably could over time. There might be some people who have difficulty with it. Maybe they're stuck in kind of glycolysis. Um, so this would be like people who are kind of insulin resistant, and what can happen sedentary. So what can happen is they don't have enough mitochondria when you put fat or protein. And when you're trying to oxidize those in mitochondria, they're all going to basically output in the electron transport chain. If those are backed up, then what will happen is your body will default to glycolysis. And the reason why is output is going to go to lactate in the serum. And so that's why a lot of people get stuck in just having difficulty oxidizing fats or proteins because their body is basically just stuck in glycolysis. And that the reason why is because protein and fat are backed up, and so the only output available is like lactate. So maybe in those conditions, people might have some issues, but that's why I think movement's important too. Especially low level movement. That's going to um, increase PGC, what's called PGC1 alpha, and that's kind of like the master regulator of mitochondria. And so, like if you're doing low level movement over time, what your body's going to be doing is building more and more mitochondria, and then over time that will help mitigate that problem of being stuck in like glycolysis.
All right. So it essentially comes down to protein deficiency, fiber deficiency, and a low level movement deficiency.
Yeah, I think those are probably the big three. Really, if you get enough protein, you get enough fiber, you're moving enough, then, and you're kind of limiting saturated fat. Uh, Trying to keep it under 10% or like under 7%. If you have like ApoE4, which is ApoE3 and 4, then you probably want to get a little less. But beyond that, I think that if you hit those three things and hit your calorie target, you're gonna be all right. in terms of the macros, that's not talking about micros at all. But in terms of the macros, weight loss, sports performance, you'll be doing all right.
All right. So since we're talking about saturated fats, I think there's something else that requires attention. At least in the US, I think it is a matter of discussion now about fructose. Like I think
Yeah.
high fructose corn syrup has been a topic lately. So what do you like? What's your take on fructose? Is it like really as bad as it's made out?
I think it can be. It's really contextual, and I think the name it probably should have been named something else if we're being honest, because we hear high fructose corn syrup, and where our mind goes is that it contains primarily, fructose and not much sucrose. But the fact of the matter is, it's only a little bit higher in fructose than just like table sugar. It's like 5% higher. But I think the thing with fructose is it will be metabolized a little bit differently, and so it's going to basically go into your liver and be metabolized by DNL or de novo lipogenesis. And so I wouldn't say that it's like per se bad. Where it's bad is where you're getting it in extreme quantities. I think in the United States at least, like sodas are really popular. You can go into like a gas station or convenience store, and you can literally walk out with a 64-ounce or even more soda. So if you're drinking like a lot of high fructose corn syrup, and a lot of sodas per day, you're doing this in a hypercaloric state. That's going to be an issue. But if you are eating an energy balance, I don't think it's or in a deficit, I don't think it's too much of a concern, really. Especially if you're in a deficit. I mean, you're going to burn that stuff off pretty quickly.
Right. Kunal, you can take it forward.
So, Greg, you were talking about fats. So, there's a lot of misconception about seed oils. You spoke about the benefits of PUFAs and MUFAs. So, can you dispel a little bit of fear about seed oils?
Yeah. So, what's really interesting is when you look at when you look at the research, it's kind of hard to find research that shows that they're really bad. A lot of the like long-term research shows that there might even be some benefit to it, but the concern is really kind of the overconsumption of PUFA, and it's just a little easier to oxidize in the body. And the way that you could think about it is imagine a cell, and you could think of it as like it has spaces between it, so things can move in and out. It's kind of like taking a lot of balloons and then you're making a circle, so you can small things can still fit through. When things are peroxidized, imagine that balloon popping, and so that balloon is just going to pop. And oftentimes, what can happen is that will set off this chain reaction where like all balloons around it will start popping too. And so that's the danger of having too much omega-6 or PUFAs is the peroxidation over time, and that can be mitigated by just I would say not getting a crazy amount of them, and then also getting enough vitamin E in your diet and the right kinds of vitamin E, because there's some synthetic kinds of vitamin E that can kind of make things worse. But if you're eating nuts, if you're eating olive oil, things like that, it's going to be, I think, fine. And I guess my position on PUFAs would be, I think the thing about like seed oils is, maybe they're not bad. Kind of the research shows, like long-term research that we have shows that they may not be as evil as we think. But I guess my question would be, there's so many other good kinds of fat that I think there's the argument from my standpoint is like, why would you eat them when there are all these other great fats that you could get?
Right, right, Greg. Uh, so the next thing we want to talk to you about is your project, Dark Lab, on GLP-1 agonists. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, so I started Dark Lab, and the reason why I started it is I was kind of running into limits of length and the detail that I wanted to provide in threads on X. I want to do more long form stuff. And so I started that, and the name is really kind of an ode, an homage to the early days of science, and uh, where people were kind of working independently in these candlelit labs. You had Galileo, who was like grinding glass for telescopes, so you could see the stars in greater detail. So I think so much scientific progress was made during those times, and it was made just by, in many cases, just individuals who were really curious, and a lot of them didn't have formalized backgrounds. So that's kind of where the name comes from. I know it might sound kind of ominous or subculture, counterculture, whatever, but the name is really an ode to science. But what I'm going to be working on in the first few posts is trying to figure out why when people go off GLP-1s, they'll gain their weight back. Because I think that obesity has been increasing in the world. I saw something on X today where it's like in the US, like it's like under 10% of people are actually metabolically healthy. And to me, that's like, just shocking. The biggest lever that we have is to get people to lose weight and get down to a good body weight. And a great tool for that is these GLP-1s. They really are, in my mind, kind of just like miracle drugs. People go on them. It's so much easier to lose weight. But when they stop, they start to gain it back. It's like, I think 50% or so people who stop GLP-1s will start gaining their weight back. And so the first post is going to be really kind of focused on that. I think that it is probably multifactorial, but I think at least two of the things that are going on there is one, not enough fiber. And so they're not getting enough production of these endogenous GLP-1s to really kind of get their hunger down. And then the other part that I think is an issue is when there is liver fat, which they might lose the weight, but they may not address the liver fat. When that happens, there's a compound, it's called DDR, DPP4, I believe. Hopefully I didn't get that wrong. But when you start getting insulin resistance in the liver, that will increase a lot. And what its job is to actually break down those GLP-1s. And so what I think may be happening is that you have this kind of perfect storm where people eat more, they gain more weight, that results in more liver fat. Their endogenous GLP-1 is broken down faster and faster, which then makes them hungrier and hungrier, which then causes this feedback loop where they continue eating more, gaining weight, and their endogenous GLP-1 is broken down faster and faster. And one of the reasons why these GLP-1s work is they're actually engineered so that they're not broken down in the body really quickly. The parts of the peptide that would be cleaved by DPP4 are actually enhanced in these peptides. That's why they can last like 3 to 10 days in our body. So that's going to be the first post. And as part of that, and one of the reasons why I haven't finished the first post yet, I thought it'd be a lot quicker, but I decided to do an N=1 experiment where I made this simulation that would simulate if you took in various kinds of fiber, like what kind of amino acids those would be fermented down into, and in what ratios, and like what part of the colon it would be, it would land in. And using that simulation, I was able to create my own formulation of a fiber mix And so I've been testing that in really large doses, like, 36 grams of fiber at one point in time. But it's been incredibly successful. If I have, one of those protein shakes with this fiber mix in the morning, I literally do not want to eat until like 5 or 6 p.m. with that big of a dose. So it appears to be working.
That's amazing. I think if that's an option, then definitely it will be healthier than these drugs, probably because of muscle wasting and all that probably can be avoided, right?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent. And I do think, a portion of that muscle wasting, I think is just it crushes your appetite so much that you just don't have the appetite to eat protein. Protein can be pretty satiating. So even with my shake, like I'll have this shake with the 36 grams. It has the same problem because it crushes my appetite. And, it's hard for me to get down a protein shake even later in the day. So I think probably one of the problems is maybe a little bit of you know having the dose a little too high. So if you crush appetite too much, that's when you're going to run into these protein problems, not being able to get enough, and that's really going to lead to the muscle wasting.
Right.
So, yeah. So since you're like you're deep into tech and stuff, uh, what do you think is the role of AI going forward? Like, how is AI going to make things better for us?
Yeah, I think that um, there are a lot of people who think that it's going to solve a lot of the problems that we have magically. I think some people think that it's going to cure aging in these like really short timelines. Uh, I think there's some issues with that thinking, which is, you know, AI is only going to be as good as its training set. And if you spent any time in the literature, uh, you'll run it. You'll notice how many gaps there are in the literature. How many questions cannot be answered. In fact, there's this doctor named Dr. Tro, and he and I got into this friendly debate on X, and we took things to the edge of the literature where we realized we just had to shake hands. We're like, we can't answer this question, so we can't determine who's right. So, if you spend enough time in literature, you'll find these holes every day, and that's something that AI just can't, overcome. Where I do think it's going to be great, though, is like accelerating current scientific progress. It's really good at synthesizing what we do know. So, even if you're using it individually, it's almost like you can do your own meta analysis, just by combining studies and having the AI help you determine what's correct across those studies. So with that, I think it's absolutely going to accelerate, but at the same time, I do think there's going to be a hard limitation, or the rate limiting factor is going to be um, how do we close the gaps in the literature, and then ultimately, if it helps you form a hypothesis, you got to test it, and these tests can be expensive, they could be time consuming, especially for longer running trials. So I think that's always going to be kind of a rate limiting factor is how many experiments can you run. But in terms of, I think the two areas to summarize where I see it working really well is helping us find new discoveries in the existing literature. And then the second thing is just helping us formulate better hypotheses that have higher chances of success in the experiments.
Right. So the final question for me is, uh, how does your research process look like? Right? Like, do you dig into papers? How does it look like? And what do you suggest? Like, how do you suggest a newcomer or somebody who's like tired of all this misinformation out there, all the noise out there? How does that person filter out the substance from the noise?
Yeah, I love those questions. So I think my process is it's kind of caveman. So I'll tend to find something that I want to look into, and I'll read a paper. I'll go for a walk. I don't take any notes when I read the paper because I'm trying to really kind of assimilate the main points. And so I'll just kind of do that iteratively. I do everything on my phone, just because it's it's limited. I can only read one thing at a time. I do most of my writing on my phone too, just for that reason. But I'm always trying to, I think one thing I'm always trying to do is look where there are patterns. And this kind of leads into the advice for newcomers is it can be a little dangerous to look at a single study and make a conclusion. Really the hallmark of good science is going to be replication. Does something that we discover, does it repeat? That's what real science is, not a single experiment. And so if you're researching something, try to get as many papers as you can and see what it looks like and look for counterexamples. Try to find a paper that disproves, what you just read if you can. And so really trying to look at what were the winners, what were the the losing tests, and then also looking at kind of the hierarchy of evidence. And so if you want a real shortcut, what you can do is read something like a meta-analysis where a lot of this work will be done for you. And so if there's a topic you're really interested in, just go do a search on a meta-analysis for that topic, and somebody will have done the work for you. They will have looked at dozens of papers. They'll show you the selection criteria, and then they'll show the results. So that's probably the biggest shortcut, is just to look for the meta-analysis. I would say the second thing is try to get as familiar as you can with just like the basic statistics. And it doesn't take long, but try not to get intimidated by that section, the results section. You can put it in a chat GPT and have it explain it to you. But knowing what a p-value is, knowing what the confidence intervals are, can be really helpful. That's probably one of the single biggest things that could up-level your skills in doing your own research, is just understanding the statistics of it. And it can be intimidating, but it doesn't take long. Just put some of those results in chat GPT, ask it to explain those stats to you, and after a few times you'll get it. The third thing would be like, try not to be intimidated. It can be really intimidating, reading research, because when you start, they're going to use all these terms that you may not know. And I think our tendency can be to kind of like feel intimidated or feel like you don't understand it and just stop. But I would encourage, if you're feeling that way, try to lean in and try to do your best to understand it. And over time, all of these terms will become familiar and second nature. If they're talking about pathways, you'll learn them. And it's just the amount of time that you spend doing it, you'll get it eventually. But just, you can't do that if you're intimidated going in.
All right. So Kunal.
Right, Greg. If we have a couple of minutes, I want to just go off tangent. We've been talking about nutrition. What do you think in the modern society, modern life, stress, how does it play a part, and what are the big stresses in our lives, and how do they sabotage our health?
Oh gosh, stress can be like such a killer, because really it influences everything in our body. It really throws things off track. It will interrupt our sleep. We might be waking up in the middle of the night. It may make you make poor decisions on what you eat. You may be too stressed out to even work out. It will cause all sorts of inflammation. So stress in excess is not good. And I think that it can be also hard to avoid in modern life. I mean, if you have a job, there's going to be some element of stress. If you have a family, same thing. So I think the key is, trying to learn how to eliminate unnecessary stress. And then the second thing would be try to figure out healthy ways to mitigate it. And so whether that be going on walks. Walks are, I know I talk about walking all the time, but walking is one of the best things I think for stress, because it's going to start balancing your parasympathetic and sympathetic states, making it a little bit more parasympathetic. So walking is really good. Any kind of exercise is really good. Breathing exercises can be great, or doing something like HRV training, where you can get biofeedback on your heart rate, and it can train you over time how to bring that down. Spending time with friends, trying to avoid destructive activities, like whether that be numbing out somehow, either through alcohol or drugs or binge eating or doom scrolling, whatever that may be. Just trying to minimize those to the extent possible, and then just making sure that you're eating and sleeping well as you can. And eating especially can be hard when you're stressed out, because it's harder, I think, to plan. And so if you're having that problem, can you meal prep? Or if you have a tendency to eat junk food, maybe one of the things that you do is try to not bring junk food into your house, so you don't have that option. And I think the other thing too is not trying to do too much at once, because, ironically, trying to find new ways to de-stress can be overwhelming if you're trying to do everything at once, and can actually make stress worse. So I think just starting really small, understanding what those triggers are, and then just go for a 5-minute walk. If you're not walking for 5 minutes, walking for 5 minutes is going to be better than not walking for 5 minutes. And once you finish, you're going to feel so good about yourself that you did it. It's going to motivate you to do it more. So I think just taking small steps and being easy on yourself, having a lot of self-love, will be really helpful.
That's an amazing message. And anything else, Dave, you want to ask before we?
All good for me.
Yeah. So over this 1 hour, we discussed so many topics, and amazing knowledge Greg has, and the way he presents it in a simple way. I think it's been an amazing session, Greg. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.